Well, good morning once more, Old Testament survey students. This is Mr. Albers, and for the final time this semester, I am coming to you as we kind of take our crash course through the lives of Samuel, Saul, and now David, covering the book of Samuel, or as we think of it now, the combined books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So today we're going to go through David's reign as king. I remember we left off with the death of Saul yesterday, and then we'll talk about the sins of David, who, even though he was a man after God's own heart, was far from a perfect man and had many flaws and was definitely not the chosen king and deliverer that the Israelites ultimately needed. So we will start off with David's early reign. These are generally the better years, first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel. So let's dive in. And we'll again pick up right where we left off. So at the very beginning of 2 Samuel, which again recall that the break between 1st and 2nd Samuel is due to length, not because it's really a new book. So David learns that Saul has been killed in battle by the Philistines, and his response is not to rejoice. His response is to lament, to cry out, to mourn. In fact, he composes a song for Saul and for Jonathan. Your glory, O Israel, is slain. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. A little bit counterintuitive to what we would expect. We would expect David to breathe a sigh of relief, and maybe he did, and think, at last it's my time. But he shows in this response that he is a better man than Saul, right? Saul, when he realized David was a threat to his reign, just continually chased him and tried to kill him. David, when he had multiple opportunities to kill Saul, refused, said God will take care of him in the proper time. That time has arrived, and David still mourns the death of his enemy. He's compassionate, and he has a heart that's like God's heart. And we can be sure, I think, as well, that a lot of that grief is just made more acute, right, by the death of his good friend Jonathan, who fell defending Israel and defending his father in battle. In fact, one other thing that we could say, you don't have to write this down, but when a messenger arrives and who gives David the news, the messenger makes up a story that he's the one who killed Saul on the battlefield, thinking that David would reward him for doing that. And David's response is to have that man executed for killing the king of Israel. And we might say, well, he didn't really kill the king of Israel. No, but he claimed to. He took credit for it. That's basically a confession. And so based on David's information, that guy was guilty. And again, it shows that David's response, even to the end, is it is not legitimate to kill the king that God has put in place. All right, well, David, we'll have to skip over this, but there's actually a very brief 2-year civil war. One of Saul's sons, who was at home, not at the battle, named Ishbosheth, survives, tries to claim the throne. There's fighting, and eventually the nation goes over to Israel. Ishbosheth is assassinated, and kind of a little deja vu. The men who do that show up to David, say, hey, we've killed the king. Reward us, and David has them executed once again for killing the king of God's people. So again, David, though he is making a legitimate claim to the throne at this point and willing to defend it on the battlefield, is not in favor of just taking out his enemies willy-nilly. And so one of the first things David does is he goes to Jerusalem to conquer Jerusalem, which is in the midst of the promised land, but is on a mountain and has never really been fully controlled by the Israelites. So David goes, the inhabitants, the Jebusites, actually mock him, basically say, hey, even we're in our fortifications, even the blind and the lame could fend you off. And David gets in, he conquers the city. He finishes what Joshua had started hundreds of years previously and conquers Jerusalem. And he makes it his capital. And what does the capital of Israel need? It needs the Ark of the Covenant. So David sends, they have the Ark of the Covenant come. Don't have time to go deep into this story, but one of the people who's carrying or who's with the ark, which is being carried on an ox cart, which is not the way you were supposed to transport the ark, according to the law. So they're doing this improperly. The oxen slips. The Ark of the Covenant's about to slide off. And so this man Uzzah, one of David's soldiers, reaches out to stop the Ark of the Covenant from falling off of the cart. And as soon as he touches it, he is struck dead on the spot by God. And David is not happy about this. And in fact, the Ark of the Covenant is stopped there. He says it can't come to Jerusalem right now. And it remains in another man's household for several months before David comes around and decides to have it brought in. Again, don't have too much time to go into that, but one of the very, very important points from that story is that Uzzah's mistake, especially if we're tempted to think God is being harsh here, Uzzah's mistake is he thought that the mud on the ground would do more to defile the ark than the touch of sinful man. And that's not true, right? Think back to the point that may have been made about the Tower of Babel, right? I think we kind of imagine like the rocks or the bricks that were being, put together and built into this tower in opposition to God as being forced against their will, right? The creation did not want to rebel against God. It was humanity that chose that and that dragged creation into a fallen state with it. I think we see kind of the same thing here, right? The mud isn't dishonoring God. The mud's just doing what dirt and water do when they mix. It's doing exactly what God has set up. But Uzzah is sinful, as are we all. And just as you couldn't go into where God was in the Holy of Holies without being struck down because God is holy, you can't just treat his ark however you want to and act like you're clean, because we're not. So very sobering story there. But eventually the Ark of the Covenant does come in, and David, this is actually him in this depiction right here, he dances around and he's dancing with joy, and there's singing and there's praise, and it's a great celebration. And they bring the ark in and they pitch a tent for it, and Yahweh is now going to make his home in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem from that time on really becomes kind of the place where God is living for the next several hundred years. And ultimately we know that that's the place where Jesus will be when he is crucified and then resurrected. All right, now the ark is there. It's in a tent. David builds a palace, and then David starts to think, I'm living in this palace. The ark of God is in this tent. That's not right. Like, God needs, I shouldn't have a nicer palace than God. I want to build God a house or a temple. Same word in Hebrew. And so he goes to Nathan the prophet, who's somebody who has been with him, who is a true prophet of the Lord, and he says, hey, this is what I want to do. And Nathan's immediate response is, yeah, that sounds great. God's with you. Why don't you do that? But then that night, the Lord appears to Nathan, and the Lord gives him a different message to bring back to David. And there's a little bit of a play on words in this. So before we read some of the verses of this, in English, the word house can mean different things. It can mean a dwelling place, like a home, the place where you go to live. It can also refer to a family. We use this really mainly when we're talking about royalty, right? We might talk about the House of Windsor if we're talking about the English royal house right now, or the House of Tudor. Or it's more, we don't use it as much anymore, but your house can also refer to your family, or if you're royalty, your dynasty, right? So David has wanted to build God a house, quote unquote. God says, David, I'm going to build you a house, quote unquote. And in Hebrew, the play on words actually works the same. David is thinking immediately, I want to build God a structure, a place to live, and God is saying, instead, David, I'm going to build you a dynasty. And he goes on and he says, when your days are fulfilled and when you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you. Okay, so there is that really poignant word. That word offspring, which we've seen all the way back in Genesis 3:15 and then used with Abraham as well. We'll go over that in a slide or two. But your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. Okay, so we're starting to list some of the answers to number 16 here. So David's going to have an offspring, a physical descendant, right? He'll come from your body. So meaning not just somebody who's kind of like you, David, but somebody who is descended from you, who will have a kingdom. Okay, what else? He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, this is interesting. And this kind of introduces us maybe to the fact that when God makes promises, a lot of times those promises have layers. They have levels of fulfillment. Maybe we think of the promise to Abraham that his offspring would bless the nations. In some ways, the Israelites did that in the Old Testament, but ultimately the blessing of the nations comes not through the Israelite nation, but through Jesus. In this case, even in this one verse, we see kind of a two-layered, we see two layers of this. So let's look at the first half. Your offspring will build a house for my name. Well, house, if we take that as temple, who is it that builds the temple? Maybe you're familiar with that. It's actually going to be David's son, Solomon, who has not been born at this time in 2 Samuel 7 yet. David's immediate son is going to be the one who builds God the temple. But look at the second part. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Okay, well, Solomon had a good 40-year run, but he didn't live forever, right? He didn't reign forever. And so we know that that's not referring to Solomon. In fact, we know the rest of the story, right? That's referring to Jesus. Well, what is it? Are these two things contradicting each other? No. Solomon comes first and is just a little picture of what Jesus will be like. What does Jesus say while he's on earth, right? Destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. And he's not referring to the building, he's referring to his own body. Because, as cool as it is that there was a building that God's presence came to dwell in, Jesus himself was God in flesh, living, breathing, walking around, talking, God with us, God among us. Much better, a much greater reality than any temple or tabernacle could ever be on its own, which, incidentally, is why we don't need a temple or a tabernacle anymore, because Jesus is the better thing. Let's go on, and we'll see these layers again. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. We can read even more significance into that than David could, because we recognize that this offspring is going to be not only a descendant of David, but also he's going to actually be God, the Son of God. So we have, father and him a son. When he commits iniquity, which is a fancy word for sin, right? I will discipline him with the rod of men and the stripes of the sons of men. Well, Jesus never committed iniquity, right? So here again, we've got most likely a reference to Solomon and maybe to some of the later human kings in David's line who did experience God's discipline when they sinned. But maybe we can also see a little bit of a hint of the fact that even though Jesus himself was not guilty of any sin, he stood in the place of sinful people and was disciplined with the rods of men, right? He was crucified and beaten by men, not for his own sin, but for sin that he took upon himself, the sin of people like you and me. And we get to verse 15. But my steadfast love will not depart from him as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. Great promise there, right? I will be faithful. I will be with him. I will not remove my love from him. Solomon, we'll see this next semester, he made a real hash of things towards the end of his life, but God did not rip the kingdom out of his hand for the sake of David. And again, we'll cover that in January. but God is going to keep his steadfast love on him. And then ultimately, in a greater sense, Jesus himself, right? Jesus goes to a cross, into the grave, and at no point does God stop loving him. Yes, God disciplines him. Yes, God places his wrath upon him as he stands in the place of sinners. But God's love doesn't fail. And, to steal a verse or steal a quote from that great movie, The Princess Bride, death can't stop true love. All it can do is delay it for a while, right? And God in his love raises the son from the dead, and their relationship continues, we would say. And then here's the kicker. Your house, there's that, that play on words, right? Your house, dynasty, and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. All right? So we've got a promise that an offspring is going to live and reign forever, and it's going to be an offspring of David. Okay, so now let's go to the second half of number 16 and think about how does this promise, which we call the Davidic covenant, this covenant that's made with David, build upon the previous covenant promises that Yahweh has made in the Old Testament. So let's look at that on the upcoming slides. All right, so let's go all the way back to the beginning. That verse again, Genesis 3:15. Hopefully, we've gotten it, impressed upon us so far that this verse is super, super important to the biblical story. God promises that the offspring of the woman, right, will defeat the offspring of the serpent. He, singular, shall bruise the head of the serpent, shall defeat God's enemies, and you shall bruise his heel. Right? So we've got an offspring who's going to defeat the great enemy of God. We mentioned yesterday, I think, that David kind of foreshadows this a little bit when he goes out single-handedly and defeats Goliath, the great enemy of the people. David is doing in a small, little, temporal way what Jesus does when he defeats Satan one-on-one. Okay? So we've got an offspring who will crush the serpent, who will rescue God's people. Fast forward to the time of Abram, who would then be renamed Abraham. And God promises him, in you, and later, God will use the exact same terminology, through your offspring, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Okay? Now, does Abraham at this point know it's the same offspring as Adam and Eve were promised? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe he thinks it's somebody different. Maybe there's going to be two heroes. We can look back through the lens of the New Testament and the entirety of the biblical story that God has revealed to us and say that's one offspring. He's going to be offspring of Adam and Eve and crush the serpent. Jesus is. And he's going to be an offspring of Abraham who's going to bless the nations. Very interestingly, in the New Testament, there are two genealogies of Jesus that were given. One by Matthew, who starts with Abraham. One by Luke, who goes all the way back to Adam, showing that Jesus fulfills both of these. But now we get to add a third piece with David. So let's do that on the next slide. David gets promised an offspring who will reign forever. Okay, and again, just like Abraham, we can speculate. Does David know that this is the same offspring that Adam and Eve were promised and the same offspring that Abraham was promised? Or does David think this is somebody different? We can't necessarily know what David knew, but we can look, again, through the lens of the rest of Scripture and see this is one man, right? All these different threads are coming together over time as God weaves this story together like a master author or like a master craftsman and creates this beautiful picture, this beautiful tapestry that's all pointing to one person, the man who is also God, Jesus Christ. which is why we say things like Jesus is always the answer. The Old Testament is about Jesus. Because even though we don't necessarily get his name, we don't necessarily get a spelled out play-by-play, this is what Jesus will do, all of these elements are teaching us about this one who will come, who will be a Son of Man and a Son of God, who will defeat our enemies single-handedly, who will bless not only Israel, but all of the families, ethnicities, nations of the world, who will sit on a throne that is not stopped by death or time, but that lasts forever, who will be an offspring of Adam and Eve, an offspring of Abraham, an offspring of David, all together at once. Now, having hit those high notes, we've got to come down a little bit, because that's kind of the tip top of David's reign, right? God makes this great promise to him, I'm going to do these things for you. And David has some more successes. He's generally successful when he goes out on the battlefield. And then it all kind of comes crashing down in his life. And that starts with 2 Samuel 11 with the famous story of David and Bathsheba, which we will turn to now. All right, so this is not David's only sin, but this is his greatest sin, right? You can read about this at 2 Samuel 11 and then 12 for the aftermath, and we'll talk through this. But we find out that David's men are out on the battlefield fighting a war that needs to be fought, and this time, instead of going with them, David stays at home. And that's kind of our first sign that this is not good. Like, I forget who it was who originally said, but an idle mind or idle hands are the devil's playground, right? When we're not doing the things that we're supposed to be doing, oftentimes that's when we are at our most vulnerable. And that proves true with David. So he's at his palace, he's walking along, he's got a view of the city, and he sees this woman, Bathsheba, bathing. And it's not really clear from the text. We don't get a whole lot of details, like, was he going out looking to try to see her? Was she there knowing that she could be seen? Who's at fault? How? We don't get those details. But this is the wife of one of his soldiers who is busy out on the battlefield, far away, fighting a war that David really should be at. So David should have been out there. He sends for her, and they commit adultery. Or at least he does. Again, the text isn't really clear to what extent, if any, she was complicit. It's entirely possible that she was unwilling in all this, and it's just he was the king, he had the power, and this would be rape in that case. It's also possible that she didn't necessarily mind this. It's also within the realm of possibility that she was looking for an opportunity to try to get in with the king. We don't know. The text doesn't tell us. Regardless, they sleep together, she becomes pregnant, and she lets David know, and now David's a little bit in a pickle, right? Because you can only keep that hidden for so long, and it couldn't be pregnant with her husband because he's been out on the battlefield, and surely people saw her going to David. What is he going to do? So he decides he's going to try to cover it up. He calls Uriah in, he summons him in from the battlefield. Uriah travels, he gets there. David tries to say, hey, why don't you go spend some time with your wife and enjoy, her company, hint, hint, while you're here. And Uriah over and over again says, no, my fellow soldiers are out on the battlefield. They're not getting the comforts of home. They're sleeping in tents. Like, how could I do that? Like, I'm not going to do that for them. Or I'm not going to do that when, they're going without. And so you can kind of see David get more and more frustrated. Like, he tries to get Uriah drunk so that he'll go home, and it doesn't work. So finally David decides, okay, I can't cover this up. Uriah's got to go. And so he sends Uriah back with a sealed letter that has instructions for his murder, basically. So the letter is sealed, so Uriah is carrying his own death warrant, gives it to the commander of the army, Joab, and the letter says, Joab, attack, and when the fighting is fiercest, make sure Uriah is at the front and have everybody else pull back so that he'll be killed by our enemies. And Joab, to his shame, goes along with this. There's some hints in the text that Joab's not really thrilled, but whereas he could have said, no, I'm not going to, he chooses to obey the orders of the king, and Uriah is killed. And David's basically had him murdered. And then, David has the gall when Joab writes back that Uriah is dead. David has the gall to write back, don't be too sad, people die in war, basically, which basically David has made a complete mockery of God's law throughout this time. And he follows it up by waiting for Bathsheba to finish her time of mourning and then going in to marry her. Again, there's not really a good sign as to whether she was on board with this or whether she was forced. And so if we were to kind of make a list of the 10 words again, which hopefully you still remember, we could just go down the list and say, okay, what has David violated? You shall have no other gods before me. Well, he's lusted, right? At no point in this is there any indication that he stopped and thought, what would God have me do? Hasn't really done that. You shall not make for yourself an idol. Well, we could say that David's desire to sleep with Bathsheba, his lust after, has become an idol, right? He's been pursuing that, and then his desire to not get caught and to maintain his reputation has continued. Commandment 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So which includes don't trash God's reputation. Well, David, the guy who's been given this great promise from God, has completely dragged God's reputation through the mud at this point, right? Think of the devastation we feel when a famous pastor or leader gets caught in a great sin, right? David is in many ways the foremost representative of God on earth at this time, maybe second to the high priest, Abiathar, but otherwise, David's the guy who's supposed to be the man after God's own heart. We don't necessarily know if he violated the Sabbath, but, honoring authority, no, he's abused his authority. He's used his authority of king to commit murder, obstruction of justice, among other things. Do not murder, yeah, he murdered. Do not commit adultery, yeah, he committed adultery. Do not steal, he stole another man's wife. Do not bear false witness, oh, he lied. Do not covet, yeah, absolutely. Basically, David has trashed God's law. And God is not mocked, right? God is not up in heaven thinking, well, could be worse. No, David is going to reap the consequences of this. So the prophet Nathan comes to David. He's sent by God, and he comes to David, and he tells David a story, a parable, if you will. And the parable is of a rich man and a poor man that both had sheep. The poor man has only one that he loves dearly. The rich man has great flocks and herds. The rich man has a guest, needs to kill a sheep for supper, and instead of taking one of his many, many lambs, the rich man goes, takes the poor man's lamb, kills it, and feeds it to his guest. And we can kind of see, we know what's coming. David is the rich man who has taken, Uriah's wife and has committed murder in the process. And David is furious when he hears this story, and he says, tell me who that man is. He deserves death. He should pay 4 times for what he's done. And because Nathan opened with a parable, David is ready then for Nathan to say, it's you. You're the man. And David realizes that he's condemned himself. And at this point, when everything is falling apart, when David has done something that's so bad that you can make an argument that Saul never did anything this bad. In fact, it's entirely possible that Saul was completely faithful to his wife throughout his marriage. David shows himself here to be different than Saul because he repents. He doesn't make excuses. He responds by saying, I have sinned. And he goes on to write in the aftermath of this Psalm 51, which is a very sad but also a very beautiful song of repentance. You've probably heard, I'm going to read just a few of these verses. I'm sure that you've heard some of these before. But this is Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. We'll skip down a few verses. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. You can just hear David's desperation to be cleansed, right? Lord, clean me. I can't fix this. Because he can't bring Uriah back, right? He can't undo what he's done. He is a man who is broken, but he repents. Now, just because he repents does not mean that there are no consequences. He has turned back to the Lord. That is the most important thing about his response here. And it does show that he is a man after God's own heart, that he is broken by sin, even his own sin. But again, just because you repent does not mean that the consequences go away, and it's to those that we turn next. So as much as we may hate this reality, sin has splash effects. It damages not just us, but the people around us. And there are some sins we might think, if I look at this in the privacy of my own room, or if I think this thought, or if I say this just to one other person about this other person, or whatever it may be, that's really not hurting anybody. Yeah, I shouldn't do that, but it's no big deal. That's not the way things work, right? Think of the first sin, Adam and Eve, that plunged the world into sin and misery and death. Our sins affect the people around us. And the bigger the sin, the bigger the splash effect tends to be. And this is the case for David's sin. And this is, number 19. So the first consequence that's announced is that Nathan says the son that was born to you in Bathsheba will die. And this is an instance where it's hard for us, right, to think, well, what has the child done? The child's not guilty. And at no point does the passage say the child is guilty. But God, he's the creator, he's the just judge, and he is the one who gives life, and he is the one who takes life away. And in his kingly authority, he decides to do that. David fasts, he goes without eating, he prays, he pleads with God for mercy. Please don't take the life of my son. And then his son dies, and David has been so desperately praying that his servants are actually afraid that if they tell David that his son is dead, that he might hurt himself. And so they're kind of trying to stay away from him. And David sees the way they're acting and realizes, my son is dead. And as soon as his son dies, he cleanses him, like he washes himself, from his crying, and he goes in to where he goes into the house of God, or the tent, and he worships, and he eats again. And his servants ask, well, what are you doing? Like, when the child was still alive, you were not eating, you were broken. Like, what's happened? And David says, I can't bring him back, right? While he was alive, I said, who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me and that the child may live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. Which seems to be a little glimmer that David was hoping that one day he would see that child in the new creation again. And many people, in fact, look to this passage as evidence that it may be that God in his mercy allows all who die before a certain age or a certain mental awareness to be part of the new creation. So there's a lot more that we could say about that, but that's David's first son. Later, unfortunately, things just continue to go downhill. David's oldest son, who's an adult by this time, is named Amnon, and he's got a half-sister named Tamar. Now, David has taken several wives up to this point. It's something, again, we don't really have the time to go into, but it results in a lot of kids and a lot of half-siblings. And Amnon, long story short, he lusts after Tamar, and he tricks her and rapes her. And then he sends her away and refuses to have anything to do with her. David is furious but does nothing. And the text doesn't tell us why, but it could be that at this point David realizes, well, I've done stuff like that. I've stolen a man's wife and had him killed. Who am I? Like, what can I say to my son that he couldn't just throw back in my face? And so because David does nothing, Absalom, another one of his sons, who has the same mother as Tamar, so who's Tamar's full brother, arranges to have Amnon murdered. And then Absalom has to head for the hills so that he doesn't get arrested and punished for that. And David longs to call Absalom back, but again, he doesn't. It's almost like his sin has paralyzed him. Now, for those of us keeping track, this is now 2 of David's sons that have died. Okay, remember what David said about the rich man in the parable. That man deserves to pay 4 times. Okay, gets worse. So Absalom, eventually David summons him, after 3 years, has Absalom come back, but then refuses to see him, refuses to act like things are reconciled, doesn't even try to reconcile. And so you can imagine what this is doing to Absalom, right? He's seen his half-brother violate his sister, and Dad hasn't done anything about it. Then Absalom decides to do something about it. Dad still doesn't do anything, except Absalom has to flee. Dad makes no effort to go reach out to him. Finally, he gets called back and is allowed to live in the same city, but Dad doesn't want anything to do with him. And Absalom, you can just see how this would mess with him. And he decides that he's going to take over, and he stages a coup, and David actually has to flee for his life from Jerusalem lest he be killed. And Absalom takes over, and David is on the run again, this time not because of Saul's sin, but because of his own sin. Eventually there's a battle. David tells his men before the battle, please, please, please don't kill my son. Please take him alive if you can. And against those orders, Joab, his commander, finds Absalom and kills him. And David is crushed. In fact, he says, would that I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. And now that's three children that David has lost. And this will not happen until after his lifetime, but shortly after David dies, a 4th of his sons tries to take over the throne and is executed. And so, just as David said, that man should pay 4-fold for what he's done. David kills Uriah, and 4 of David's sons end up dying prematurely as a result of that. But that's not the end of the story. And so, remember that the Lord is a God who is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, who is faithful, who keeps steadfast love for thousands and forgives iniquity and transgression and sin, and who will by no means clear the guilty. We've seen how God does not clear the guilty. We've seen how sin has splash effects, but there's a positive side of this story as well. Because God forgives David's sin, we can be confident that we will see David in the new creation despite these terrible things that he did, because his sin, which he couldn't cleanse, would be cleansed about 1,000 years later when David's greater son and descendant, Jesus, hung on a cross and bled and died for the adultery and the murder and the cover-up and all that David did in the affair with Bathsheba and afterwards. There's another son of David we haven't mentioned as part of the sin. He has another son later with Bathsheba, right, with the woman that he committed adultery with, Solomon, and Jesus will come from this line. In fact, Bathsheba will be one of only 4 women that are mentioned in Matthew's genealogy, showing that even though she shouldn't have ended up married with David, right? That's David's sin that led to that. God didn't throw out his promise, and he even used David and Bathsheba despite the sin that led to them being together. And the Davidic covenant remains intact. God does not leave or abandon David. God's promise that David will have an eternal dynasty remains and will hold true, and Jesus is born from David's line to reign forever. And so I think we can close on this note, as dark as it is in many ways to look at the final part of David's reign. We've got to see the faithfulness of Yahweh highlighted in this as well. Even when man attempts to out-sin God's promises, you can't do it, right? God will be faithful. God will be true, even though every man is a liar. And so when we find ourselves caught in sin and we feel dirty and we feel unworthy, if our trust is in Jesus, right, if we are covered by his blood, we're not going to suddenly find a sin that Jesus' blood doesn't cover. We're not going to find a sin that the cross was not sufficient for. And God's faithfulness will always trump the unfaithfulness of his people. It was true with David and is just as true for you and for me. So on that note, that is the good, the bad, and the ugly of the book of Samuel and the characters of Samuel, Saul, and David. And we will pick up with Solomon next semester. And that's it.